Obviously, first hour, we're focusing on the latest Ebola news because it gets even more ridiculous. We have an article here out of the Daily Mail. President Obama has basically outlined his mission to defeat Ebola. Obama's new airport screening plan uses customs agents to spot Ebola as president concedes we don't have a lot of margin for error. So basically, the same people that rifle through your bags at the airport are going to be checking people for Ebola. And if you have confidence in customs agents to do that, then you probably missed the next article, which went up on Infowars.com yesterday. I'm going to play this clip after the break. CNN reporter returning from Liberia, horrified by lack of airport Ebola screening. So this CNN reporter and several of her colleagues basically traveled through Atlanta airport and were, quote, shocked by the complete lack of screening for Ebola. They outright told the airport officials, the customs officials, that they had just traveled back from West Africa, that they could potentially have been exposed to Ebola. Basically, they weren't even asked any questions. They were allowed to go on their way. No checks were taken. So if that is the character of the provisions that the Obama administration is now taking in the fight against Ebola, as now the WHO in Europe warns that it's basically inevitable that Europe will see an Ebola outbreak after a case in Spain yesterday. We've now got articles suggesting there could be potentially 56 other people exposed to the Ebola virus at this hospital in Spain. There you see 56 being monitored in Spain after Ebola infects nurse. So the WHO is really taking this seriously in Europe, saying this could lead to an outbreak, whereas in the United States, there's no talk whatsoever of banning flights. US not considering a travel ban amid Ebola outbreak, says the White House. And again, they've stuck to that line for, you know, over a week now, basically. But if you thought that was crazy, then take a look at this out of the Daily Mail. Dallas Ebola victim's stepdaughter, who took him to hospital as he was vomiting wildly, is given all clear to return to work as a nursing assistant. So this is the stepdaughter of patient 0, Thomas Eric Duncan, who, of course, was taken ill in Dallas last week with Ebola after they sent him home for a period of days, having failed to detect the virus, even though Duncan told them he had traveled back from Liberia. Now they're sending his stepdaughter, who was in the apartment with him, with the vomit-stained blankets and towels. She was in the ambulance with him as he traveled to the hospital. And again, it can take up to 21 days for people to show symptoms of Ebola, and yet the CDC has given the all clear to send this individual back to work as a nursing assistant. Absolutely unbelievable, and that's just the tip of the spear.
In the past decade, we have witnessed unparalleled scientific discoveries in the area of health. But no one has put together a formula that focuses directly on brain health, nerve growth factors, and optimizing your cellular energy at the same time. DNA Force is one of the most expensive formulas to produce. Some of the ingredients in DNA Force are $12,000 a kilogram. We are using the coveted, patented, only American source of PQQ, CoQ10, and more. You want the best that's out there at the lowest price anywhere? Well, we're bringing you a total win-win. The ultimate value, cutting-edge, trailblazing game changer that also supports the InfoWar. We have produced a limited run of DNA Force, and it will take up to 12 weeks to produce more once we sell out. Secure your DNA Force today at InfoWarsLife.com or call toll-free 888-253-3139. DNA Force from InfoWars Life.
Now we're going to go to a CNN clip, and let's just preface this with a quote from Josh Earnest, the White House press secretary, on the subject of Ebola. He said, quote, "There is a very sophisticated, multi-layered screening system in place to ensure that the traveling public is safe." That's the White House press secretary, Josh Earnest, a couple of days ago, talking about the preparations that they're making for Ebola. Of course, they've refused to shut down any flights coming in from West Africa. Now we're going to have customs agents, the same people that rifle through your bags, supposedly screening for Ebola in airports, even though technically that can be sidestepped. You can take ibuprofen and not register as having a high fever. So it is indeed completely useless. Obama's new airport screening plan uses customs agents to spot Ebola. So Josh Earnest, the White House press secretary, ensures us that the traveling public is safe because now they've got these measures in place to catch Ebola at the border before it arrives in the United States at the airports, which is not the experience of CNN reporters who traveled through Atlanta airport last week. Let's go ahead and roll that clip.
I expected that they were going to take my temperature, they were going to ask me lots of questions, but they didn't. I said, I'm a journalist, I've come back from Liberia, I was covering Ebola. And the gentleman who was helping me, the officer, he started to hand my passport back and say, welcome home. But instead he said, oh, wait a second, I got an email about passengers like you, hold on a second. And he went and conferred with someone, and he didn't know, and they conferred with someone else. And in the end, he said, you need to watch yourself for signs of Ebola.
So again, that's a CNN reporter and a couple of her colleagues basically saying that she went through the airport in Atlanta. They barely even asked her any questions. They said, oh, yeah, we got an email about it. We might want to ask you about that. But, you know, nothing happened. And again, we go back to the fact that people can take painkillers, ibuprofen, to fool these temperature detectors anyway. So the threat of Ebola tourism, as was rumored in the case of patient zero, very much remains in place. So the White House, again, has refused to shut down any air travel, any air flights coming in from West Africa. And now the CDC has gone one step further in its complete insanity in its response to this Ebola crisis with this story out of the Daily Mail. Dallas Ebola victim's stepdaughter, who took him to hospital as he was vomiting wildly, is given all clear to return to work as a nursing assistant. The stepdaughter of Texas Ebola victim Thomas Duncan, who called 911 and rode in the ambulance with the man she calls daddy, has been told she can return to work. Miss Jalla, whose contact with Mr. Duncan, who remains in a critical condition, was far more intimate and prolonged than that of her husband, told Mail Online on Monday, the CDC came yesterday. They said I can go back to work, but I do not know what I will do. I will not go back yet. Doctors say that no one is at risk of catching the virus unless they come into contact with a sufferer who is exhibiting symptoms, which, as we'll get onto in a moment, is apparently not the case. A New York Times article from 2000 suggests that even people who aren't exhibiting symptoms of Ebola can infect other individuals. And again, going back to this family, when they were holed up in the Dallas apartment as the CDC sent unprotected workers to clean up the vomit on the sidewalk. We showed you those pictures a couple of days ago. As they were holed up in there, given no advice by the CDC, and as the family told the media, they quarantined themselves. They were not even told initially by the CDC to remain in quarantine. Later, you had armed men show up with guns who had to keep them in quarantine because basically they were given no information whatsoever. So now the CDC has told the stepdaughter of the Ebola victim that she can go back to work as a nursing assistant. The potential for her to infect other people is vast, working in that environment. In fact, we had the founder of Ebola just yesterday come out and give an interview to The Guardian, in which he said one of the main threats was Indian workers who are in West Africa at the moment, traveling back to India, working in hospitals and infecting people that way. So the very discoverer of Ebola, of the Ebola virus back in the 70s, is warning against this, that you can't send people back to work in hospitals willy-nilly. There you see apocalyptic scenario. Discoverer of Ebola virus fears it could mutate, and he's saying that because it's infecting so many people now, even though it hasn't, to all our knowledge, gone airborne, that it could mutate and go airborne eventually. And he's saying that basically a lot of these workers, these hospital workers in West Africa, could go back to India and infect other people. But that doesn't seem to concern the CDC, who have told the stepdaughter of patient zero, and this is not out of The Onion, this is not a satirical article, this is being reported widely today, that she can go back to work immediately as a nursing assistant, even though she was in the ambulance with the Ebola victim. She was handling the vomit, the sweat, the blood-stained sheets of the Ebola victim. And bearing in mind that these symptoms can take up to 21 days to show, and yet the CDC has said that she can go back to work. She should be in quarantine for at least 3 weeks. They should be running numerous tests on her because, as we will see in a moment, a lot of these tests turn out to be false negatives. They can test for Ebola, and the initial test says that Ebola is not found. Later tests can confirm it. So we're going to get into that into a moment. But the CDC is not ordering, but suggesting that the stepdaughter of the Ebola victim can return to work, even though she could be infected with the virus and just not showing symptoms for the next 3 weeks. And this is key because the New York Times reported back in 2000, some may carry Ebola without showing any symptoms. This is 14 years ago we knew about this. The Ebola virus, which has caused deaths from high fever and bleeding in African outbreaks, can also infect without producing illness. According to a new finding by African and European scientists, the possibility of asymptomatic infection was only suggested in earlier studies, they said in last week's issue of The Lancet. Now they said they had documented such infections for the first time. They've found that the Ebola virus could persist in the blood of asymptomatic infected individuals for 2 weeks after they were first exposed to an infected individual. So everything we've been told so far by the CDC is that you can't infect anybody else unless you're already showing symptoms. That has been discounted in this study, which was published in The Lancet, a prestigious medical journal, 14 years ago. And yet this nurse is being sent back to work, having had direct contact with patient zero. There you see the article out of the New York Times. And then there's this, out of Newsweek, why it's important to do multiple tests on suspected Ebola victims before releasing them. And it gets into the fact that people have been tested for Ebola and the results have come back with a false negative. They're tested again subsequently and they're found to have the Ebola virus. So all of these individuals that have been in contact with patient zero there in Dallas, we don't know how many have been tested. We can't really trust the CDC given that they've been so lax on dealing with that family alone. You know, the vomit-stained sidewalks were cleaned up with people without protection. It took almost a week for an actual properly trained, properly equipped hazmat crew to completely clean and disinfect and sterilize that apartment. And then we have false negatives. So people could be being tested for Ebola, it comes back negative, and yet they could still have the virus, and yet they're sending the nurse back to hospital where she could potentially infect hundreds or thousands of other people. The insanity absolutely knows no bounds. And then we've got the border situation again. No interdiction at the border whatsoever, even though, according to this report, government figures indicate that 112 individuals were interdicted illegally crossing into the United States from Guinea, 231 from Liberia, and another 145 from Sierra Leone, the three Ebola hotspots. The period of these apprehensions was one in which we had a larger Border Patrol presence on the actual border than we do now. So there were more Border Patrol agents in service back then when these figures were recorded. Now there are less, and this doesn't even include all the people who were not interdicted by Border Patrol agents. So God knows how many more hundreds of individuals from Liberia, from Sierra Leone, are crossing the US border, potentially having been exposed to Ebola. And again, we had the speculation that patient zero, Duncan, had engaged in what's now being called Ebola tourism because he told his boss that he was traveling to the United States to get treatment, having himself been infected with Ebola after taking one of his pregnant family members to hospital in Liberia. So this could really start a wave. We had an article a few days ago. There you see boss co-workers of US Ebola patient. He knew he had Ebola. US trip was desperate attempt to survive. So speculation that he boarded the plane simply to get to the US to get treatment because West Africa is, of course, completely overwhelmed. He would have likely died or suffered a really long illness without proper treatment. It's the Alex Jones Show live with me, Paul Joseph Watson. We got breaking news here. Connecticut governor declares state of emergency over Ebola as a precaution. So it seems that whereas the White House has dropped the ball on this, it's now being picked up by the states. Connecticut Governor Daniel Malloy has declared a public health emergency for the state as a precaution during the Ebola epidemic that is affecting several countries in Western Africa. He signed an order declaring the emergency on Tuesday, and it gives the Commissioner of the State Department of Public Health the authority to quarantine and isolate people whom the Commissioner, quote, reasonably believes have been exposed to the Ebola virus. So that's a higher standard of proof than the CDC requires. Of course, we had the CDC measures reported back a couple of months ago where they said anybody with any respiratory illness could be quarantined, or indeed anybody who was a healthy person. They used the words well persons that were coming in into the airports, that they could be quarantined by the CDC. Now the Connecticut governor is taking it one step further. There you see the executive order from Obama. Anybody with respiratory illnesses, this from the Connecticut governor, is a higher burden of proof, reasonably believes has been exposed to the Ebola virus, is the quote. So now they're taking their own steps to try and deal with this Ebola threat, even as the administration and the CDC completely drops the ball. Here's a clip from a local news channel reporting on a Border Patrol agent, National Border Patrol Council union, blowing the whistle on the threat of Ebola from individuals entering from Liberia and Sierra Leone. Let's go to the clip.
Recently, agents caught immigrants from Liberia, one of the West African countries hit the hardest by Ebola. Now the Border Patrol Union is saying if immigrants did bring the virus, it'd be hard to contain. But according to Chris Cabrera with the National Border Patrol Council, immigrants from those countries are already making their way here.
Not too long ago, we did catch some people, I believe, from Liberia.
So that's the situation on the border there. Hundreds of individuals from Liberia, from Sierra Leone, being caught there. And again, just think of all the ones who are not caught. And this was at a time when there were more Border Patrol agents there to interdict them. It's amazing the fact that they can't even recognize people who dress up as ISIS terrorists and carry out staged beheadings, as we had with our own Joe Biggs. Also, James O'Keefe, going across the Canadian border in a speedboat. They failed to pick up that, and yet we're expected to trust them that they can detect people with signs of Ebola. We keep hearing this thing about how the authorities have proper training, and yet the hospital in Dallas, where patient 0 arrived, they had gone through the Ebola training before he arrived, yet they sent him home with antibiotics, even though he told them he was from West Africa. And of course, that led to the situation now where his own stepdaughter is being sent to work as a nursing assistant, even though she was exposed to him. Complete dropping of the ball by the CDC, complete incompetence. Or is it more? We're going to get into that with Robert David Steele.
Do you understand how dark it is? How far down the line we are? How late it is?
And of course, if you saw the video up on Infowars.com yesterday, he gave an interesting prediction last month. He said that an Ebola staged false flag attack was coming. So we're going to drill down. We're going to ask him if what we're seeing now with the Ebola outbreak is what he characterized during his appearance on the Alex Jones Show last month. But there's an interesting article, given that we've reported numerous times the threat that the Ebola virus could mutate and go airborne to at least a limited extent. Experts worry virus may spread more easily than assumed. This is out of the LA Times. Dr. C.J. Peters, who battled a 1989 outbreak of the virus among research monkeys housed in Virginia, and who later led the CDC's most far-reaching study of Ebola's transmissibility in humans, said he would not rule out the possibility that it spreads through the air in tight quarters. Quote, "We just don't have the data to exclude it," said Peters, who continues to research viral diseases at the University of Texas in Galveston. So, David, you wanted to talk about that.
Yeah, Paul, we're seeing two different types of responses. We're seeing a medical response and we're seeing a political response. And on the political side, it has been downright reckless. That's why we've run articles saying that they're standing down, that they're doing everything that they can to spread this. It goes way beyond just trying to keep people from panicking and not spreading fear. What they're doing is putting people recklessly at risk the way that they're portraying this. And I think the person that best represents this is the guy who really is at the center of what's happening in Dallas, and that's this Judge Jenkins up there. He also he's a district county judge. He's somebody that first kind of came to light back in the summer. He was trying to get thousands of children, as they were saying at the time. They had all these unaccompanied children, young children with teddy bears coming across the border by themselves, making the thousands of miles journey across the border. So he was going to house them, and he very notably went door to door intimidating people about not protesting this, saying that they weren't going to put up with any protests of people bringing that in. That got him a seat across the table when Obama came to Dallas, even though Rick Perry was seated at the far end of the table. An interesting picture that you can find of that, where you can see the expression on Perry's face. But the bottom line is this guy is a rabid pro-illegal immigration advocate. He's up for election in a couple of weeks, and he's been telling people that there is no risk, and he's been the one who's been issuing the quarantine orders quite a bit late, but then also going into the apartment, making a big show of the fact that he's going in without any protective clothing, going to a press conference afterwards and saying, I'm wearing the same shirt that I went in and hung out with them in the apartment, and then I transported them and their belongings in my personal car for 45 minutes. And I'm wearing the same shirt at this press conference that I wore with them. I'm not afraid of this. There is no risk, is what he said. That's his quote. There is no risk. Well, the reality of it is that the materials in the apartment, just as they quarantined the ambulance because it might be contaminated, just as they tracked down that homeless man and under this judge's orders put him under quarantine. They tracked him down not once, but twice. They brought him in once and they tested him. They didn't find any symptoms. He then subsequently left. They did another manhunt to bring him back and then put him under isolation. So we're seeing a very schizophrenic approach to this, but he goes out and tells people that there is no risk. Well, the reality is that you can come down with it. It's been reported by the New York Times. You can catch it from materials, and it is present for up to hours or sometimes days, depending on the material, depending on the condition, whether it's exposed to sunlight. He was so late in doing anything at the apartment that he may very well have not exposed himself to any risk. But what he is doing is modeling reckless behavior for the people in America that might come into contact with this. You know, the cemeteries in Liberia are filled with the bodies of people who never thought they could get Ebola. And so what he's doing is a big disservice to people. This virologist, Dr. Philip K. Russell, who was part of that experiment, I'm sorry, he was not one of the persons who was part of that experiment. He's with the U.S. Army's Medical Research Development. He says to be dogmatic is, I think, ill-advised because there are too many unknowns here. Now, there was another guy who was part of that experiment that you referred to where the monkeys got out of control, and his name is Charles Bailey. He supervised the response, and he said what he learned from the episode informs his suspicion that the current strain of Ebola that is afflicting humans might be spread through tiny liquid droplets propelled into the air by coughing or sneezing. In other words, by aerosols, which is exactly what they were doing the other day when they were pressure washing without any protective equipment the area where he had thrown up on the sidewalk, not cordoning it off from the public. Then the next day they send in a hazmat team to clean the apartment. That's the kind of inconsistency, the kind of nonsense that we're seeing, the difference between the medical response and the political response.
And of course, we had the University of Illinois study, which I reported on a few days ago, which again, they were talking about the potential aerial transmissibility of the Ebola virus. They were saying that it could transmit more than 3 feet, which is the current understanding with people coughing and sneezing. So,
yeah, we have that, and we have the Canadian study that you had talked about. And what this guy continues to say about these monkeys that were dying of Ebola, he said they were dying in a pattern that was certainly suggestive of coughing and sneezing, some sort of aerosol movement. They were dying and spreading it so quickly from cage to cage that we finally came to the conclusion the best action was to euthanize them all. That's the way they stopped it.
And of course, I mean, we had the Public Health Agency of Canada. They admitted on their website, as of August, that was the last time it appeared on the website, that Ebola, they strongly suspected, I believe the exact words were, that Ebola had gone airborne in humans, at least to a limited extent. That was subsequently censored in light of the most recent spate of outbreaks in Western Africa, and they completely deleted that information from their website altogether. So, I mean, David, do you think this process of deleting information, which we've seen in a couple of other cases, in fact, the German virologist who went public and said that basically this wouldn't end until the population of Liberia was basically wiped out. He talked about 5 million dead. His quotes were later removed from that article when we highlighted them in an Infowars.com article. So, I mean, David, do you think this attempt to remove information is part of a deliberate cover-up, or is it just a botched attempt to prevent hysteria?
It is a deliberate cover-up, I believe. It goes beyond just trying to control hysteria. Look, he could control hysteria by telling people, educating people so that they would understand what their risks were. If he wants to go into the apartment and he wants to tell people that I think it's safe because it's been so many days, but instead he just says there's nothing to worry about. There is zero risk. And they're, like you pointed out, they're removing information. They're also pushing this narrative that we're going to somehow be saved by pharmaceuticals. If you look at the article that's up on USA Today, and I'm trying to find it here in my stack of articles. I've got so much information here, but basically what they were focusing on was the various times that people have been given experimental drugs. What they don't tell you is that Dr. Kent Brantley and the lady that was also working with him, who were both given ZMapp, who both recovered. I don't know about her, but he was definitely given a blood transfusion at the same time that he received that experimental drug. 2 others were also given that experimental drug. One of them, and they both died in other countries. One of them was a Spanish priest, where now we see that Ebola has transferred to somebody for the first time outside of Africa. So not only did he die, but now there's one person. There was reports yesterday about a possible second person. I don't know if that's changed or not yet. But at least one person has contracted Ebola there, and that was from a patient who was treated with ZMapp and subsequently died. Now, there's another experimental drug that was used on another doctor that was different from that. He subsequently was cured, but he also received a blood transfusion. He was sent a blood transfusion from Dr. Kent Brantley, the fellow who recovered, because he had received that transfusion from a patient that he had treated in Liberia. He sent that to him. So that doctor also received a blood transfusion from someone who had recovered, who had antibodies in their plasma. And at the same time that he got the experimental drug, now he is back in the hospital. They were saying that it is not a recurrence of Ebola. They weren't saying exactly what it was, but today, it was interesting, in this USA Today article, they said the FDA has blocked any further trials of that drug because it produces some severe flu-like symptoms. So it may be that it is secondary side effects of that drug, that maybe it did cure him of Ebola, but there are these secondary side effects. And then there's this new drug that they're using on Mr. Duncan in Dallas, the Liberian patient. And that is a drug that they have used in the past to treat viruses. And although it has killed it in vitro in a glass, there is absolutely no evidence that it has been responsive in treating it in people. And I don't know if they've done any animal testing or not. So that's really kind of a wild shot that they're just putting out there.
So, I mean, in 2009 with the swine flu, we saw this huge hysteria. There were reports of potentially troops on the streets in reaction to this hysteria which could occur. The difference then is they had the drug, the vaccine, lined up, and everybody took it, even though only elderly, sick, and young people were at risk of contracting swine flu. So for the large majority of the population, of the global population, that wasn't a threat. At the time, they played it up like it was doomsday, like it was the end of the world. With the Ebola crisis here, we've seen a slow burn. Do you think, David, that they're really going to ramp up the hysteria once they get a drug in place, whether it's effective or not?
I absolutely believe that's what they're waiting for. And as a matter of fact, we covered last week in the Nightly News, there was information that the Gates Foundation and several pharmaceutical companies were coming together to mass produce the ZMapp vaccine, the one that is basically had a 50% success rate so far. And you can't necessarily even say that it's that high because, as I pointed out, at least one of the patients who recovered, one of the 2, had also received a blood transfusion, but they are ramping up to produce that massively. And of course, that is something that is genetically, there's a lot of genetic modification, transgenetic modification going on with the process of that drug. At the moment, it is a plant-based genetic modification, but they're getting ready to move it to an animal-based genetic modification, which brings up all kinds of issues about rushing to market with something like this and creating a panic or forcing people to take this kind of vaccine. I'd point out that this drug that is being given to Mr. Duncan now in Dallas is also, I believe, genetically modified. The company that created it is called Chimerix. That might be a clue as to what they're focused on. They're called a biopharmaceutical company, so not a really good sign there as to what's really involved there. But it has been effective at the adenovirus. Interesting that back in March, there was a young boy who was suffering from cancer. He had a marrow transfusion and got the adenovirus, and they could not get access to that under compassionate use. They had to create a social media campaign. They got 24,000, 29,000 signatures on Facebook and basically forced the company and the FDA to allow this young boy to have that. He subsequently recovered, but they knew that it was effective against the adenovirus. It had been tested for quite some time against that. This is a completely new experiment that they don't know about.
Now, this story which I read this morning, again, it's not out of the onion. It sounds like it could be. But they're actually sending the stepdaughter of patient 0, the Ebola victim in Dallas, back to work as a nursing assistant 7 days after they first detected this Ebola case. Of course, we know 21 days is the maximum up until when Ebola symptoms can be detected. They can remain dormant until then. We've also got reports that people can carry Ebola without showing symptoms and be able to infect other people. That was a New York Times article and indeed a scientific study which was published in The Lancet back in 2000. And yet the CDC has told this nursing assistant that she can go back and work in a hospital despite the fact that she was exposed to this Ebola victim. She handled the towels, the bed sheets, the vomit, the blood-stained material that this Ebola victim had been in contact with. She rode with him in the ambulance to the hospital. David Knight, I mean, another example of the CDC. I mean, it gets to a point where this doesn't even look like dropping the ball anymore. It looks like deliberate incompetence.
Absolutely. That's a very good case in point. If you look at the two families that were involved there were two households that were put under quarantine. Incidentally, neither of them, after they were put into quarantine, were given any food. Even though Judge Jenkins was talking about how compassionate he was, that was given by private agencies, by the Red Cross. And when the people brought it in, of course, they were not wearing protective clothing. Nevertheless, the two different households, one of them were the people who were directly living in that apartment that he was staying in. She got involved, this stepdaughter got involved because she sent her children over there on a Friday night while he was very sick. And that, I believe, was the day before. That was the day that he went to the hospital the first time. When she found out that he was sick, she had her children taken back. But then she went on Sunday to take care of him. As you pointed out, there's a very detailed narrative from the New York Times talking about how she bought him a blanket, wrapped him in the blanket, took care of him. And she was the one who got the ambulance to come because he didn't want to go back to the hospital again. He had been there and they had just basically sent him away without doing anything. So he was reluctant to go back. As a nurse, when the ambulance drivers came in, she said, "Don't come in unless you put on gloves and a mask. He's been to Liberia and there may be viruses." She didn't use the term Ebola. So she was very much involved with his care. They didn't say that she rode in the ambulance with him, but she took the blanket that he had been sick in with her to the hospital and set it there in the emergency room with her where she was. Now, they have not ever taken really the position that she was totally quarantined like her children. They continued to allow these children to go to school for another couple of days, then took them out, then put temperature monitors in the schools where these children had gone. Then they told this lady and her husband that they could go to the stores to get groceries, but the kids had to stay in the house. Then 7 days later, and that is the very minimum time I've seen anywhere. Most of the places say you will not manifest symptoms until 8 to 10 days later, and as long as 21 days later. But the CDC tells her 7 days after exposure, go back and work as a healthcare worker. I mean, that is
when you look, the very worst situation to be in.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's just mind-boggling what they have done. And yet they're making a hero out of, we're seeing articles in Time Magazine and the Washington Post talking about how this judge is fighting fear and Ebola in Dallas and how courageous he is and how he's taking the lead in all of this. There was an interesting article I mentioned to you that I saw in Foreign Policy talking about the toxic politics of Ebola, and the subtitle said, in Guinea, the epidemic isn't just killing people, it's threatening to tear the country apart. In other words, it's not just that people are dying, we could lose our political power here, which is really all they care about. And that's why we're seeing the kinds of responses. It's to bolster the political people as well as to make money for the pharmaceutical companies. Once they get a drug, they're going to come on with a full panic. We've already seen a Connecticut governor sign a bill giving himself authorization to use emergency force whenever he feels like it.
Still talking about the latest Ebola news with David Knight here in the studio. And just during the break, we were making the point that, you know, Obama has said that they're going to enforce these new measures. These customs protection agents at the airports are going to check people for signs of Ebola, probably a week too late in that case. Obviously, we know from the previous CNN report that they're not even doing that. They're not even asking basic questions. But don't worry, because the TSA is still going to grope your junk. They're still going to confiscate your alcohol, tobacco, and they're going to protect us from the deadly threat of snow globes. That's all safe. That's taken care of. If you've got Ebola, though, you can go right on through, no questions asked. Maybe they'll give you a questionnaire. But this is the insanity of the CDC and the federal government's response. Now we've got an article up on drudgereport.com, which is talking about how the troops are traveling there. American troops in Liberia will come in direct contact with infected. And of course, we've had hundreds of health workers in West Africa die as a result of being infected by Ebola victims, despite the fact that they obviously would be expected to take the utmost precautions. Hundreds of health workers have died. Now, thousands of American troops are going to be sent into harm's way to have direct contact with Ebola patients. David Knight.
Paul, you mentioned you asked me in the last question section, is this deliberate or is it just incompetence? When you look at this policy of sending thousands of American troops into that area to have direct contact with people, the military has said they're not equipped to deal with this. That's not their mission to go do that. So that is not just stupidity and that's incompetence. That is deliberate exposure to people. And so that alone will tell you what's behind all this. But I think it's interesting, you mentioned that the news media is reporting that Obama is going to step up his game in terms of screening at the airport. The way the New York Times headlines it, they say Ebola screening at airports will increase, says Obama. They're not doing it at all. We just had that report you played in the first hour from the lady from CNN where she comes back and she says, we were in Liberia. We were covering Ebola. And they go, oh, wait, I think I heard something about that. Yeah, watch yourself. Well, what's there to watch for? I don't know. I have no idea. And they don't check the other people that are traveling with her, even though they're also saying that. She was appalled and amazed, just like Chris Matthews was appalled and amazed that Ebola even came here after he had assurances from Obama that it wouldn't happen. So that's the kind of thing that we're being fed by the media as well as by Obama, but it is a deliberate policy of exposure to spread this along. I've also seen, and I think this is tied to the deployment of the troops, I saw an article in Stars and Stripes, and it was an op-ed piece written by someone who was a consultant for the CFR, a fellow, rather, at the CFR, and she was saying that it's great that we have Obamacare because that's going to take care of Ebola, because now anybody that's sick doesn't have any reluctance to go get health care. And it's like, really? The combination of Obamacare and Ebola crossing our borders, whether it's at the airports or whether it's coming through the southern border, the combination of those two can destroy us not only financially, but destroy millions of people. It has that potential. So it isn't that we somehow have a magical elixir Obamacare. We have a finite capacity, both in terms of beds, as we pointed out last week. I think, what was it, 19 beds in the United States that are isolation units, only one in the UK. Even in Western companies, we have finite resources. We can't treat everybody in the world, but Obamacare pretends that we do, and so does the military now.
Just mentioned this before the break. Reuters reports US nurses say they are unprepared to handle Ebola patients. Nurses, the frontline care providers, one of whom will be the Ebola victim's stepdaughter shortly thanks to the CDC, say they are untrained and unprepared to handle patients arriving in their hospital emergency departments infected with Ebola. So we've heard these assertions, these claims by the CDC that the hospitals are all prepared. Yeah, around a week ago, we in fact had nurses protesting out on the street saying that they weren't prepared, they weren't given proper training for Ebola. And indeed, the very hospital in Dallas where Thomas Eric Duncan arrived, they had received Ebola training, but of course it proved to be completely useless since they couldn't detect symptoms of Ebola. Even though he told them he had traveled from West Africa, they basically ignored the threat, gave him some pills and sent him home. But David Knight, you're going to be back in the final hour to talk about some financial issues, so let's tease that.
Yeah, there's some interesting updates in financial information. We've had an increase in the budget deficit last year of over 6%. We've got house prices that are not recovering. Ben Bernanke can't even refinance his home. And here's a guy who is making, he's a multimillionaire in terms of his salary every year. And he's got a house that's a jumbo loan, which should actually be easier to refinance. But because of increased regulations in the wake of the crash that we had in 2008, because they wanted to socialize the losses into these banks, they came back and said, but that's okay, we'll match that with increased regulation. Well, those regulations are even keeping somebody who is trying to refinance a home that is a very small portion of his income from being able to do it, the former head of the Federal Reserve. And of course, there's some new updates on the LIBOR scandal, which is probably one of the most corrupt and far-reaching scandals we've seen in the financial community since I can remember, because the LIBOR is the basis on which interest rates are set up for adjustable interest rates, and people gaming that system made billions and billions of dollars of profit off of other people. So there's some update on that as well that we'll have.
And I mean, just on the economy, obviously we had the Foreign Affairs article, which I discussed a few days ago. They were talking about how median household income in the United States has basically stagnated since 1989. People's living standards are either, again, stagnating or indeed dropping, and they're very wary of this threat. That's what they're scared could cause the populist uprising. We're going to get into that with Robert David Steele after the break. But David, I mean, just having been here 9 years ago before the financial collapse, I noticed that there's basically a panhandler on every other corner in Austin, Texas. It really seems that there's more poverty in evidence since before the financial collapse back in 2008.
Well, actually, the economy here in Austin is quite strong compared to other places. I think a lot of these panhandlers are coming here because of the weather, because of the strong economy, and because of kind of the attitude perhaps of the police department. Some places they really crack down on them, and some places they take more of a laissez-faire approach. But the real estate market here, especially in Austin, is very strong compared to the rest of the country. If you look at house prices, it's essentially come back to the peak here, and in North Dakota, where there's energy-based economy, where it plays a large part of the economy. But in many other places, they're looking at housing prices that are down 15%, 33% in Florida. I think it's like 15% in California that they've plummeted. That's a very serious matter because that's more equity than most people have. And when you add $1 trillion in just 1 year to the deficit, as we just did, that is going to create an economic malaise that we're not going to get out of.
Celebrate the spirit of freedom and liberty upon which our nation was founded at InfoWarsShop.com. Molon Lave is ancient Greek for come and take it. This popular design combines both classic Greek Spartan imagery with modern M16 assault rifles. Now available in women's tees and proudly made in the USA. And now you can protect yourself from corrupt cops with the InfoWars dash cam. It's your car's black box that records all that the driver sees and hears. And introducing the Block It Pocket. It renders your phone undetectable while protecting your private data and your health. Or take back your privacy and protect your personal information by getting your very own Detractor cell phone pouch. So get incredibly high-quality, freedom-based products and help fund the revolution at InfoWarsShop.com. CDC.com.